At Kualoa we grow a variety of crops, one of which is cacao. It's one of the most beautiful looking fruit trees that you will ever see. It has beautiful pods that are yellow, orange, red, green, and we've been growing them here at Kualoa for 11 years. We started with a partnership with the University of Hawaii program where they used Kualoa as part of a site selection to find varieties of cacao that grew the best and had the best flavor profile. This year we plan to plant another 800 trees. In the beginning part, when you plant the trees, it takes about 2.5 to 3 years before you get the first pods and you can start harvesting your cacao trees. We found that the best time to harvest when the pods start to turn color. Usually they go from a green to an orange, red, or yellow color. You can do a scratch test where you scratch the pod, and when you scratch the pod, if it's yellow underneath, that means it's ready to harvest. There is a window of time that you want to harvest the pods. If you harvest them too late, they'll start to pre-germ, which is where the seeds inside the cacao will start to germinate, and that will be unable to use for making into chocolate. So at that point, we try and pick that perfect window of when we harvest.
So cacao is an interesting crop in the sense that you not only want ripe harvests, but you also want enough pods so that the next process, which is fermentation, works correctly. So when our orchards have enough pods to consider what we would call a substantial harvest, which is anything over 350, 400 pods, we'll go in and we'll harvest, like you saw earlier, and then we'll basically crack them and extract all of the beans. Cacao is a lot like coffee in the sense that what you're looking for is the bean itself. The seed is covered by a pulp. And interestingly enough, that when you first harvest fresh cacao, the bean itself tastes nothing like chocolate. And you have to put it under a fermentation process, which is really what creates that chocolate taste that people find so familiar. Once you extract and you've drained, we basically will crack the pods using a machete. We'll pull out the beans manually. We drain them in buckets, and then we put it into what we call a fermentation box, which is basically a wood box that's been built using materials that aren't treated or don't impart any sort of flavor into the process. What you're really looking to do is you're trying to take these beans and actually change their internal chemistry. And you do that by introducing alcohol, which then turns to acetic acid, which then penetrates the seed itself, causing that chemical reaction or that desired chemical reaction. So what you do is once you take your shelled and extracted harvest, you put it into your fermentation box. That fermentation box is then covered with a layer of banana leaf. And what you're doing is you're creating the environment so that all of the local yeast, or the yeast that's going to convert your sugars, can basically start that magic, is what they do. So unlike wine or bread where you're introducing a yeast, you're actually using that yeast that's normally found on the outside of the pod. So we'll even take a few pods that are empty and roll it into our mix before starting the process. So the total fermentation process takes about 7 days. It's kind of like a staged approach in the sense that once you put it in the box and you cover it, the pulp itself starts to be consumed by the natural yeast, and that creates alcohol. And so the first few days, it almost smells like you're in when you go to a winery, you know, in that wine cellar portion of it. After the first 2 days, you start turning it daily, meaning you take all of the beans out and you put them back in. All you're really doing is introducing oxygen, because that yeast needs oxygen as well as the sugars of the pulp to cause the reaction. Once the yeast has taken all of that sugars in the pulp and turned it into alcohol or ethanol, it then ferments itself and turns into acetic acid or vinegar, much like grape would, right? Kind of like making bad wine. But what you're gonna have is that box then will start to heat up because the reaction is what's called exothermic, which means it gives off heat. Oddly enough, the hotter you can make it, the better the chocolate's gonna taste. The reasoning is because you're trying to force that acetic acid to penetrate into the bean itself using that required heat. So daily, we're not only turning the beans to basically introduce it to more oxygen, but we're also checking the temperature on a daily basis too. We're trying to get it at 120 to 125 degrees. That's something that's incredible because when you actually reach down to work the beans in the box, you not only are consumed by this perfumey acetic acid, but it's also something that you can feel the heat on your face. It's incredible. You're gonna take that heat, you're gonna utilize it to basically penetrate that seed. That seed's gonna then change its internal chemistry so that you have that chocolate taste. So if you were to take a comparison, a bean straight off the tree is bitter and has almost the flavor of like you're eating a piece of bark. It's kind of green. You take a bean that has been fully fermented after 7 days, and that will then have that chocolate flavor that you're looking for. It's not sweet yet because there's no sugar, but it has that, say, 100% chocolate that some people like.
So after the fermentation process, we're taking the beans and putting them on a drying rack and leave them in shade for the first couple of days so that they don't dry down too fast. This allows the beans to get from a higher moisture level down to 7 to 8% moisture content, which is where we want them to be. And then once the pulp on the outside has started to fall off more, we take them out into the direct sunlight. This moisture meter allows us to record moisture pretty rapidly. When we're getting close to our optimal moisture content, we're taking the readings once or twice a day. And then once we've hit between 7 and 8%, depending on the weather forecasts, we'll try to get them bagged and stored until they're taken to the chocolate maker.
So I got into this because I really liked growing trees. And so in Hawaii, we're able to grow cacao, which is an agroforestry tree. And so it's gonna, say, be planted with 3 other different types of overstory trees to create shade. And it creates a beautiful environment. And then we can take the fruit from those orchards and manufacture chocolate. So we can vertically integrate from the chocolate factory to the farm and then be able to retail, wholesale, and distribute chocolate all over the world. And as long as it's really good quality, that's what we're all about. So Kualoa Ranch will send us, say, 200 pounds of cacao, fermented and dried. We'll evaluate it and decide what kind of roast profile we want to do, and then go through the steps of converting it, smashing it up, adding sugar, doing the recipe, and then tempering it into a finished molten chocolate bar and packaged and send it back. So I personally enjoy, the reason that I like doing this is because I really liked the agriculture, tree, agroforestry side of it, and taking a product from those trees and adding value to it that we could then export all over the world. So that kind of whole feedback loop keeps me showing up every day and happy about it. You know, chocolate does make people happy. So this is kind of what Kualoa Ranch dropped off to us. It's a good example of quality beans. And one of the first things we're looking for is this reddish color and this vinegar smell. And so if those 2 indicators are coming out nice, then we would taste them. And so what I did for Kualoa Ranch, as well as any other origin we source from, is we taste them as raw seeds like this, and then get an idea of the flavor profile within it before setting a time and temperature in the roaster here. So our most important step is actually sourcing beans. So as long as the farmer does a good job growing it, which in this case Kualoa came out with really nice beans, we're going to do our best job to roast it. If we do good here, then the beans are going to come out great. The chocolate's going to be really good. And so the way this works is it's a coffee roaster, and about 30 kilos of cacao, raw cacao, go at the top. It drops inside, and then it would spin around in this drum. This is a coffee roaster, but it works really well for chocolate, for cacao. All we do is roast at a lighter temperature for a longer amount of time. And so for us, that means around 30 minutes. So 30 kilos, 30 minutes, so about a kilo a minute. And after that, when we feel it's ready, we can taste it from this hole right here, this porthole, and determine if it's finished. We then would open this gate up, everything spills out and cools on this perforated tray before going on to the next step 10 minutes later, which is to crack it. We would take all the roasted cacao, we would dump it up to the top here, and it would go through sets of rollers, and these rollers spin together like this, and then it would just slide out, and we'd capture all the fragmented pieces just like this into this bucket. At this point, we now have to separate the shells. And so that's what this is here for. This is called a winnowing machine. This happens in rice and grains and wheat, anything that's having a shell that's separated. And so the fan is blowing air all the way up this neck and into this yellow bin right here. Everything that we just cracked goes up here in this hopper. It's then fed down this chute and enters this long neck. And so everything that's light would get blown up and into the yellow bin. Everything that's heavy falls straight down. And what you can see here are clean nibs. This is the whole point. This is chocolate. We want to take this now and crush it up and add sugar. But essentially, that's 100% chocolate. So now, we would smash that up and then come into the next room. So now, we've got crushed up nibs that we would bring in here. They've been smashed to the point where the oil and the cocoa solids can be mixed together, because what nibs are is about half cocoa butter and half cocoa powder, cocoa solids. When we smash it up, those two things come together kind of like peanuts turning into peanut butter. And so if we come in and we can look in here, this is called our ball mill, and our ball mill has 80,000 little metal balls and a shaft that runs down the middle and arms on it. And as it rotates, all the balls start agitating together, and that friction generates a lot of heat, as well as starts to refine and break down further the crushed up nib. Those are the chocolate makers. And you can still see there's residual chocolate around each sphere, but for the most part, it's all been flushed over into the next machine. This is where we would add sugar, and it would start to taste like chocolate for the first time, because chocolate's not sweet or it's not milky. Those are things that the chocolate maker would add. I add the nibs in here, and then after a little while, when it's all liquidy looking, I would add sugar, and it would spin for about 3 or 4 hours. After the texture is really smooth and creamy, it's transferred over into our next machine here. It's a big holding tank, but it helps to do a couple important things to the chocolate. We're volatilizing acetic acid, so we're burning out vinegar, and then we're also making the texture better by shearing apart amalgamated particles. So we're getting too geeky here. So from here, after it's now into what we would recognize as chocolate, we would come to the very back room. This is where we would transfer all the chocolate to. This is full 200 kilos of chocolate. We would then transfer it over into here, and then we would mold chocolate bars. And so each one represents 3 different spouts. That is 1 bar, 1 bar, 1 bar, 1 bar. And so after we would mold the chocolate bars, we would run it down this vibrating conveyor. All the air bubbles come up. It takes on the shape of our mold. We'd put it on perforated trays here before then sliding it into the refrigerators. And when we do that, in about 20 to 25 minutes, if everything goes well, they come out a nice, beautiful, shiny chocolate bar. This process has its challenges because oftentimes the cocoa butter that we're trying to structure doesn't line up evenly. And so what happens is the cocoa butter rises up and the solids stay below, and you'll see this white film on top of your chocolate bar. That's not good for us. It doesn't mean that it's bad. In fact, it's totally fine. We would just remelt it and start over, but we lost our time. So this is the last step, tempering. It's a very similar process to tempering glass or steel. We just happen to have to do it with chocolate in order to line up cocoa butter. This is why your chocolate bar has a snap. This is why it melts in your mouth and not your fingers. So we have to do it. Every chocolate bar you've ever bought was at least one time tempered. Kualoa Ranch started a variety trial maybe 10 years ago, and that's when I started learning at the university. So I remember it getting started, and it was very exciting because it was such a beautiful place to grow cacao. And they ended up planting more and more, and so now we're starting to see for the first time enough volume get delivered to us that we can do things at scale. And so not only for us at scale, but also Kualoa Ranch can now ferment in bigger batches, which makes the fermentation go a lot better. I don't know what it is about fermenting on a small scale. There's less control and you can't repeat it as often, but on a bigger scale, your quality tends to be better every time. And so now they're hitting that point, and so when we were just tasting beans, I can just look at the color, I can smell them, and then tasting them, and all three of those indicators of good quality are there. And so now I have an idea of how to roast it, and I know that they're gonna get good chocolate back. This is gonna be their best batch ever.
Now, once they pop out, we would depan them and then we'd run them through our packaging machine here. And that's the entire process from bean to bar. So whether you're the biggest chocolate factory in the world like Calabo or Mars or Nestle or Hershey, or you're a small craft chocolate company like Manoa Chocolate, you still have to follow these same steps. The difference is we work really closely with the growers to make sure people like Kualoa Ranch does a really good job so that we can make good chocolate. On the farming side, they're doing the most important part for flavor.